tell us what are the different reasons for a firm using an interim service?
Yeah, cool. And one of the things that when clients are looking for interims, it's normally for two different reasons, type of reasons. So it's either planned or reactive. So it's normally a planned or reactive resource. And it can be for really positive reasons like growth, as well as during more challenging times like turnaround or transformation. And planned reasons can be for major programs or projects or to provide bench strength we see this a lot, particularly around finance, to embed processes or procedures. And then reactive reasons can be a result of M&A activity or during significant growth phases or the classic sudden departure or poor performance. And what interims will do is they'll provide that injection of skills that the business needs. Interims are normally high direct and they lead to drive through some sort of change, but it's normally at director level. They're a really flexible resource because the client's got the ability to bring in the senior level talent as and when they need them. And so it's really efficient, it's really sustainable, and it's a really value add proposition. And sometimes it's often part of the overall kind of talent strategy for the business as well.
Okay, great. That's a great explanation of kind of the planned versus reactive needs of an organization in bringing in somebody at an interim level. One of the things that people may ask about are what are some common misconceptions about interim roles? And I'd like to start with Jeff. What are your thoughts on what are some misconceptions about interim roles?
I think talking to people for the first few times or an exploratory conversation, I think sometimes there's the perception that it's very, very short term. So sometimes people are scared off thinking that it's 2 months or 3 months. And I actually think more often than not, it's the opposite. We're often starting with 9 to 12 months and we've gone all the way up to 24. And so I think there's the connotation around interim that it's temporary, but a 24-month assignment is a pretty good contribution to an organization. And so I think it's really kind of trying to read from the client's perspective is what's the commitment or how much planning can they put into the assignment is. If someone says it's 6 months, they've got medium commitment. If someone says it's 12 months or longer, they've got a really great commitment to that role. I think there's a lot of flexibility with interim, but you can't make a lot of difference or a lot of change within a 2 or 3 month window. I think there's a common understanding that, if you've only got a gap for 2 months, an interim person may not be the best fit. It's actually the opposite. It's where you've got something that needs some real strategic change or you've got a real problem to get around. And, 9, 12 or longer really is required. So I think the most common misperception we come across is just that people think that it's much shorter term work, but it's actually longer term strategic work more often here.
Great. Yeah, that's a great point there on the length of time for the roles. Mike, is there anything you would like to add around, some common misconceptions?
Yes, thank you. I would say there's often a misconception on the interim not being welcomed into part of the leadership group or the business as a whole. And I would say most interims at the executive level are being hired specifically for their key expertise in whatever project or change and transformation needs to be delivered. So we find that interims at the executive level are really encouraged and really supported by the business to drive this change because it's got to the stage that the business needs to hire that individual. And I think there's a slight misconception around interim being a perhaps easier route to get into different industries. I would say that's a slight misconception in the sense that when an interim requirement is had, it's to ensure that someone can hit the ground running from day one. So often within interim, having either industry or particular sector expertise can be really, really important to have that very fast hit the ground running start.
Great. And that just kind of leads into the next question. And I'm going to pose this to Adam. Adam, how is interim leadership different than traditional leadership?
Yeah, I'll touch on a few. And I think the first and most obvious is compensation, the employment structure. So traditional leadership, you're typically looking at salary, sometimes stock units, long-term incentive plan, whereas interim, it's very uncommon and almost unseen to have any sort of bonus, short-term or long-term incentive plan. you're either working as off a base salary, so W-2 salary, 1099, or on an hourly basis, depending on the scope and the type of role that you're filling. So that's a big difference in the first one that we talk to candidates about. The second, of course, and Jeff talked about it, is the time commitment. Traditional leadership, I think anything under 3 years, unless there's special circumstances, probably considered a failure if you're in a permanent leadership role, whereas interim, you're looking at a minimum of usually 12 weeks to 24 months. I'd say on the long end, 24 months is about the reach of an interim engagement, average about 6 months. And so the length and time commitment is another one. Lastly is team structure. So traditional leadership and the roles that we fill, you're always going to have a team, an org chart of folks reporting up to you. And while that will happen in interim roles, what we've also seen and being adapted as a more modern talent strategy is on-demand talent, hiring interim leaders who won't necessarily have a team reporting up to them in a spot on an org chart, but they're brought in for their specific expertise to either provide advice on a merger and acquisition, a special project. They have a niche skill set that's being tapped into. And so they'll be in more of an advisor and consultant role while still executing on work, but won't necessarily have a full team reporting up to them. And then finally, is there's not a tight political or social connection to an organization if you're in there as an interim. It doesn't mean that you don't have to be likable and someone that is easy to work with, but you're not going to be there for the long term. And so I think there's less of a concern that frees folks up to really work focused on the task at hand and what they're being asked to do as an interim.
Great. Now that's some great, differences. Just as curiosity, do you see interim roles turn into permanent positions? Is that something that might happen for somebody who's going in as an interim?
Yeah, so it does happen. And at least the data that we have, the number of conversions from interim to permanent has increased significantly over the last couple of years. If you look at the data a decade ago, anywhere from 7 to 8% was about the standard on a yearly basis for the number of interim engagements that would convert to permanent. The last 3 years, at least at Wiki at our firm, we've been just south of 15%, which is historically the highest we've ever seen. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. In short, though, yes, it does happen.
Great. And there's one question actually that just came in the Q&A, but I think it might be good to address it now if anyone would want to. It's if somebody could explain what's the difference between interim and fractional. So any of our panelists have any opinions on the differences there?
There might be two differences either in different continents. I certainly know from a UK perspective and European perspective, interim is a full-time assignment, predominantly 5 days a week, where a assignment might last 3 to 6 months. We communicate fractional in the UK more in the part-time format, where an individual might fulfill a 5-day-a-week role with 2 or 3 fractional roles. I'm not sure whether that's the same within the US, so please excuse me, or Canada, Jeff and Adam, but yeah, that would where we would differentiate it in the UK.
Yeah, same here, Mike. Same in North America.
Okay, great. Jeff, was there anything you wanted to add to the fractional piece, or?
I think sometimes the differentiation is in an interim role, you might be taking on a team and really coaching a team. Fractional, you're kind of there to add special skills and expertise. You're not really supervising a team when you're 1 to 2 days a week. So sometimes it's depending on if you're adding skills to a team that exists or you're taking over a team, on behalf of somebody else or for a special cause. So sometimes it's just thinking about where that's going to fit into the organization.
Okay, great. Thank you all for answering that question. I felt like that was one we maybe should address up front. So we're going to go into our next section, which is what makes an ideal interim candidate. And so the first question, Lisa, if you could tell us what makes a candidate a good interim executive? And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but if we could touch more on it.
We've touched on this a bit earlier, but just to elaborate on it, I think if you're moving into interim management and you want to work in interim, you've got to be a change leader and you've got to have really excellent stakeholder management skills. That's so important. With all the roles that we have, it's always about, remember, it's going in very quickly. And an assignment is, initially normally 6 to 12 months. So you've got a very short window to really make an impact. So you've got to get people on board. You can't do it on your own. So you have to have really good stakeholder management skills. And you've got to be really experienced in your field, normally at director or C-suite level, which means you've probably got 10 to 15 years experience. And you've got to be adaptable. So you've got to be able to go into a business and adapt to whatever that client is needing. And interims are always focused on delivering results. So they're normally going in really focused on trying to move the dial for the business. But once they've done that, it's also really important that they're really proactive about planning their exit. As soon as it becomes business as usual, as soon as those objectives have been completed, the interim should be then focused on making sure that they are managing that exit and not staying for that business as usual role. So that's really key. I think it's also really important that the business isn't left with a big gap once you've left that business. So you really need to work with the team that's in there, embed yourself swiftly, but you've got to be someone that is able to really achieve results and at pace.
Okay, great. It seems like they have to be, if to summarize, they have to be adaptable and agile and be able to kind of fit in and get those results done while they're there during that time.
And it depends on the business. Some businesses, they will need someone that's very strong to go in, and it's it could be real issues within that business, and they need a very particular style of somebody going into that business, and that's why the cultural fit's so important. And then other businesses, it could be growth. They need someone that's going to kind of put their arms around the team, and it's a very different environment to a very aggressive turnaround, for example. So you need the right you need to be adaptable depending on whatever that business needs.
Okay, great. Thank you. Jeff, we talked a little bit about this, but could you also touch upon what are some considerations you should have when exploring executive interim opportunities from a candidate's perspective?
I think an interesting point that we talk about with people who begin to explore the space is it's not thinking about interim executive opportunities as employment, but really thinking about yourself as a business. What are the services you provide? What are the environments that you work best in? What's the differentiator between yourself and another interim executive? And it really changes the stakeholder relationship, where as an interim executive, typically that's a subcontracted relationship, and it's as much your client as it is your employer. And that's a different stakeholder relationship. And so thinking about, are you the person who's going to go in and manage the complexities of that stakeholder relationship? To the point raised earlier, the key to it is adaptability. Is you're never going to know, 100% of what you need to know going in, and is that where you strive or is that where you struggle? And really understanding, the profession of an interim executive of treating the employer like a client and getting them from point A to point B and dealing with the adaptability and the unknown. Is that something that's going to give you energy, or is that something that could be deflating if things don't go right? It's really making sure that you're introspective enough with yourself to say this is the right opportunity for me.
Great. I really like that example of thinking of yourself as a business and treating the employer like a client. I think that's great advice for the candidates. Adam, we talked a little bit earlier about what are some candidates who will likely succeed as an interim executive, but are there any profiles of candidates that are less likely to succeed as an interim executive in your experience?
Yeah, first and foremost, early to mid-career, those are folks that we would not look at for interim roles. And as the other panelists mentioned, for the roles that we're being asked to fill on an interim basis, our clients typically need someone who has 20 plus years of experience, industry or functional role specific, that they're looking for, so they can come in with minimal guidance and go out and achieve what they're being asked to do. So early to mid-career is not folks that we would look at for consideration and don't make good interim candidates. Other things, really, it's the opposite traits of what the other panelists have talked about, but a couple that stand out to me. Anyone who's closed-minded, indecisive, lacking flexibility, someone who's bound geographically. While there is more openness now to hybrid roles, remote roles, depending on the position. A lot of industries and for really important positions still require an interim to be on site. And so if you have limitations about where you can't go, you're going to take a lot of opportunities off the table. an intern after a while, that reflects on a firm that you're working with. If we're talking to someone who can't go here and can't go there for different reasons, there's many people who also have the skills and experience and are willing to travel and get excited about that opportunity. So those are the things that I think would make someone less likely to see it as an interim executive.